So once again, those of you who are new to us, and also of course to our old friends, you're very, very welcome here to this lecture on the being brought to you by the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society. And it is my great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Michael Laffan, who will be addressing us this evening. A graduate of the University College Dublin and Trinity Hall, Cambridge, Professor Laffan lectured at the School of History and Archives at UCD for over 3 decades, a former president of the Irish Historical Society and a sought-after contributor on matters historical for the national media. He has also published extensively on Ireland's revolutionary period. And to take just a brief sample of some of his works and from his extensive contributions, his seminal work on the original Sinn Féin organisation, the resurrection of Ireland, the Sinn Féin Party, 1916 to 1923, remains arguably the definitive text on that particular subject, as it outlines the various threads that were woven together to establish that somewhat heterogeneous tapestry at this time, and thus assisting us in understanding how and why that tapestry would unravel again in the 1922-1923 period. Whilst his more recent biography of W.T. Cosgrave in 2014 also successfully addressed a previous dearth in academic examination of the first leader of the independent Irish state, and of course of the difficult and often unwelcome circumstances that those early Cosgrave administrations found themselves grappling with. And for those of you whose energies and enthusiasms for the revolutionary period have not been exhausted already by the very, very busy few years of centenaries and commemorations of centenaries that we've all been living through, and those of you who may yet to wish to further engage with lectures and discussion on the revolutionary period, I can heartily recommend Professor Laffan's podcast series on this subject, recorded at University College Dublin a number of years ago, and is available free to download from UCD's History Hub website. This particular lecture series by Professor Laffan covers the tumultuous period in Irish history and examines the interaction of different groups, in particular Unionists, moderate and radical nationalists and the British, and it examines the causes and the impact of events such as the Home Rule crisis, the Easter Rising and the Treaty, and it examines patterns of continuity and discontinuity in the period spanning the First World War, and brings the listener up to the immediate post-Civil War period, which of course brings us to the subject of this evening's lecture, in which Professor Laffan will bring his formidable analytical abilities to bear by providing us with a centenary perspective on the Civil War, and how we as a society arguably have engaged or perhaps have refused to engage with this issue in the years since its conclusion. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Michael Laffan.
Thank you, Shane. Well, like almost all Dubliners, I love coming to Galway. So thank you for inviting me, and it's a particular pleasure to address the Society this evening, even if it's on a rather grim subject. By and large, until recently, historians tended to avoid the Civil War, or if they did, they engaged in vicious controversy. Most spectacularly, one of the earliest books by P.S. O'Hegarty was a diatribe, a venomous campaign against De Valera, whom he described as the great anarch, who had created so much mischief, so much damage done by the cowardice of one man. One chapter was even entitled Devil Era. Others, on the other side, Owen Neeson, Dorothy McArdle, were less vicious, but certainly not balanced. They were, to put it mildly, partisan. Even a study by an Englishman, Edgar Holt, in 1960, devoted only 20 pages out of 300 looking at the revolutionary period to the Civil War. But since 1988, things have changed. First of all, Michael Hopkinson wrote a book, Green Against Green. And it's interesting that the Civil War needed to wait for an Englishman living in Scotland to have the first serious study of the war. But others have followed. Tom Garvin's 1922, Bill Kissane's Politics of the Irish Civil War, most recently Diarmaid Ferriter's study Between Two Hells, and various biographies of Collins, De Valera, Griffith, Owen O'Malley, the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, and there have been regional studies. In an international context, the Irish Civil War was a very small-scale affair. Under 2,000 people killed, fortunately. And we can make a comparison with another country that achieved independence at almost the same time, 1917, with a very similar population, Finland, which had a civil war in 1919 in which 36,000 people were killed. Ours was a small-scale skirmish in comparison. And incidentally, in other ways, the Irish experience was on a small scale compared to events elsewhere. We all know that after the Easter Rising in 1916, 15 rebels were shot. After the last great upheaval in a European capital, the Paris Commune of 1871, admittedly a more serious insurrection than the Easter Rising. After that, 15,000 prisoners were shot after the war was over. The executions were dragged out over years. So Ireland's events, Ireland's problems, Ireland's bloodshed were all on a relatively small scale, even if they did provoke decades of bitterness. And the Civil War was fought largely, though I will stress not entirely, over a trifling matter: the oath to be taken by members of the Dáil to the king. To use a title of one of Shakespeare's plays, was it much ado about nothing? After all, the oath was abolished. The Republic came into being peacefully within a relatively short period. This in contrast to other civil wars, the United States, Finland, Spain, where the conflict was over very serious matters indeed. It did, of course, have long-term consequences, and I'll touch on these briefly at the end of my talk this evening. There were two main causes of the war, which I'll sum up briefly as the treaty and the army. First, the treaty. The Sinn Féin movement, the party created in 1917, the Dáil which it developed or was responsible for creating, and to an extent also the volunteers, were a coalition of different elements, radicals and moderates. And it was only natural that it should break apart when the pressures that it kept together eased with the truce of July 1921. Some Sinn Féiners and volunteers would accept nothing less than total British surrender, utter British defeat, the recognition of a fully separate Irish Republic that would have signalled, effectively, the end of the British Empire. This, of course, was unacceptable to the British. There was going to be trouble ahead, whatever happened. But it was accidental. This was not in any way necessary that the split, the natural split, should take the form of two more or less equally balanced sides. And this was the result of contingent circumstances, including, prominently, the role of De Valera. In a recent biography of De Valera, Ronan Fanning, by and large a very sympathetic biography by Ronan Fanning, who would be seen by and large, I think, as on the Fianna Fáil side, Ronan Fanning remarked that De Valera was responsible for the dimensions of the war and described his conduct in 1921-22 as petulant, inflammatory, ill-judged and profoundly undemocratic. But contrary to what very many people used to think, and I suspect a few people still manage to think, partition had already been established before the negotiations began, before there was any contact made between the British and the Irish. And partition was a precondition for the treaty, and therefore a precondition for the independence of Southern Ireland. And when De Valera went to London to meet Lloyd George in July, Lloyd George made it perfectly clear there will be no republic. If you insist on a republic, go home. The talks are over. The truce is over. The fighting will resume. De Valera knew a republic was not on the cards. It would be unacceptable for Britain. It would involve a humiliating defeat for a country which had just won the greatest war in its history. Lloyd George would have been swept aside if he had agreed to a republic. The Conservatives would have taken over and war would have resumed. Of this, there seems little doubt. And yet, a republic was an article of faith for very many Irish nationalists, although not De Valera himself. After all, he did say in a private meeting of the Dáil in August 1921, after he'd met Lloyd George, but before the negotiations began in London, "I am not a Republican doctrinaire." Others were. Mary McSweeney, for example, remarked in the course of the treaty debates, "We didn't send the delegation over to compromise." Well, then why send them over at all? Unless it was to accept British surrender and defeat. So there was, on the part of many people, a deep emotional commitment to a republic. But in practice, this amounted to little more than dislike of monarchy, with the very important exception of Ireland's and Irish people's familiarity with democracy. There was little or no discussion on the Irish side about republicanism, about traditional Republican themes going back to the 16th and 17th centuries, such as the rights and duties of the citizen, the relationship between executive and legislature. This was irrelevant. What mattered was the king or no king, the crown or no crown. The Republic, then, was an unthinkable concession for the British, and it was never sought in the negotiations. The Cabinet never demanded, the delegates never demanded it. Only after the treaty had been signed did people say, "We now want a republic." And in the treaty negotiations, the Irish side faced a whole series of problems. The intransigence at home, people like Mary McSweeney. De Valera's absence, the most important negative fact in 20th century Irish history, described not unreasonably as an abdication of leadership. The status of the delegates, were they or were they not plenipotentiaries entitled to sign without referring back to the Cabinet? The Dáil said, "You are plenipotentiaries." Behind the back of the Dáil, the Cabinet said, "No, you're not really. You have to refer back to us any agreement." Now, they weren't told that the Cabinet, or rather the Rump Cabinet, those members still in Dublin, and 3 of the 7 members were among the delegates. 4 members were back in Dublin. It wasn't as if the Rump Cabinet had veto rights. That wasn't stated clearly, but there was an implication that if they were to be consulted, their views would have to be taken at least very seriously. De Valera, it seemed, even though he wouldn't go to London to meet Lloyd George, wanted the last word. And why didn't he go to London? Well, there are some good, some bad reasons. I suspect one reason is that he had already met Lloyd George. Even before he had met Lloyd George in July, very sensibly, De Valera sought advice from those who knew the British Prime Minister, including Lord Middleton, the leader of Southern Irish Unionists, who had been a British Cabinet Minister, Secretary of State for India. And Middleton said most revealingly to De Valera, "Mr. De Valera, you are going to meet Mr. Lloyd George and negotiate with him. You are a very brave man." Because Lloyd George's skill and duplicity and cunning were widely known. He had outmanoeuvred poor fools and idiots like Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. He had outmanoeuvred that shrewd and cunning man, Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France. He was a man of vast experience. And now he was to deal with a group of inexperienced Irishmen who had effectively never negotiated with anyone. And there were, as I mentioned, tensions between the 3 members of the cabinet in the delegation in London and the 4 members back in Dublin. The main issue in the negotiations were the Crown and sovereignty. Also Ulster, but Ulster was effectively solved in the sense that it was swept under the carpet. Procrastination was the interim, the short-term solution. We will deal with it in the form of a boundary commission, the sloppy wording of which a sloppy wording accepted not only by the delegates but by the rest of the cabinet back in Dublin. That sloppy wording allowed the border to remain unchanged. The main issue was the relationship between Southern Ireland, the new Free State, and Britain, or the United Kingdom. The treaty was signed in haste and immediately provoked a split in the cabinet 4-3, in the Dáil 64-57. Interestingly, in the Dáil debates, there was no great concern about social issues. Liam Mellows, of Galway fame, who later, in his last months as a prisoner, acquired a reputation as a social radical, in the treaty debates was not concerned about social issues, but simply about the Crown and the role of independent Ireland, or the Free State, with Britain. In Tom Garvin's words, monarchical symbols, which were designed to comfort and deceive British opinion, to conceal the extent of British concessions, in practice deceived much of Sinn Féin and the IRA. As Garvin went on to put it, Republicans couldn't recognise victory when it was offered to them. All anti-treaty people knew very well, and this is revealed in not only public speeches but in private letters and communications, conversations between them. They all knew that the people, the great majority of the people of the 26 counties, supported the treaty, particularly after the Christmas break, when Dáil deputies went home to meet their families, friends and constituents, and for the first time had to encounter Irish public opinion in a raw form. The treaty debates have been much criticised, but let me quote at some length a passage from Peter Hart, sadly who died very young, a Canadian historian, in his book Mick, a biography of Collins. He described the debates in these terms. They were one of the very few occasions in modern history in which Irish nationalists sought, or were forced, to define and defend themselves and their positions in open debate. And they did so often with great skill and insight, as well as with passionate intensity. They discussed Irish history, the state of the post-war world, and the principles of nationality, democracy and citizenship. There were many personal tributes of belief alongside the abstracted logic of constitutions and practical assessments of what the movement had achieved. Out of this sprang most of modern Irish politics, its parties and its ideologies. Few other nations can claim such an honest and profound starting point. Not a bad statement of the positive side of the treaty debates. The second main background cause of the Civil War was the army and its role, its attitude towards civilians, towards politics and government. Ever since the formation of the Irish Volunteers in November 1913, Irish soldiers, volunteers, IRA men, regarded politics, politicians, and even the people with suspicion. The people, it was often felt, were unworthy of their country. This was not an attitude peculiar to Ireland. De Gaulle famously regarded the French people as totally unworthy of France, but it's the Irish attitude that affects us this evening. And from 1919 onwards, from effectively the outbreak of the War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish War, the army was accustomed to going its own way. It paid deference to the Dáil. It was interested in some political developments. For example, at Salahad Beg, the first military operation of the war, when 2 RIC men were killed, as Dan Breen and his colleagues were waiting in ambush for the RIC men, they talked about what was happening in Dublin that very afternoon, the first meeting of the Dáil. So they respected the Dáil, but they didn't want the Dáil to interfere with them. They certainly didn't want the cabinet to interfere with them. And despite the fact that almost all of them eventually took an oath of allegiance to the Dáil, they didn't take it very seriously. And nor, it should be mentioned in passing, nor did the cabinet, which often regarded the Dáil as irrelevant. But then governments, whenever they can, tend to regard parliaments as a distraction and a nuisance. The army was involved in controversy even before the treaty, although most of the general staff supported the majority in the Dáil. While those politicians, particularly De Valera and Brua, who had tried to control the army before the treaty came into effect in autumn 1921, did not. Many soldiers felt an intense opposition towards and resentment of civilian control. The IRA wanted local power. It wanted to appoint its people, sometimes its very own members, to local jobs. It wanted to keep at bay the dread control of the Dáil bureaucracy, the civil service, in the form of the Dáil Department of Local Government. One local government inspector referred to the army, the IRA, in his county as the wolves of Kerry. David Fitzpatrick, one of the finest scholars of the Irish Revolution, described this attitude as the elevation of territorial jealousy into high-minded principle. Sean Moylan of Cork, in the treaty debates, remarked, "During the war, my word went in North Cork. It goes there yet." He wasn't going to allow civilians encroach on his authority. The brigade commanders in the 1st Southern Division, which had been the most active of all in the war against the British, came out unanimously against the treaty. Many IRA commanders demanded a veto on any decision to be taken on the treaty. Soldiers and not civilians should have the final word. Now, to us in 2022, in a secure and long-established democracy, some of these attitudes might seem outrageous. But we must remember that circumstances in 1922 were vastly different from those that we face today. It was largely, not entirely, but largely, the Irish volunteers who had brought about a situation in which there was a treaty to be debated in the first place. Why, it might be asked, why should they be more responsible to the people now than they had been at any time in the past 2.5 years? To accept the supremacy of the Dáil would be to allow the triumph of constitutional theory over revolutionary practice. As one soldier put it, if we had no political views, we would not have been soldiers at all. De Valera had said, "The day that any portion of the army does not obey the government, then there is an end to your fight to freedom," although later he did modify that view. Cathal Brua, however, did not modify his threat that there would be trouble if the government didn't keep its hands off the army. So, when the Dáil and Sinn Féin split, the army did too, with a vast majority of its members siding against the treaty. As I mentioned already, in the context of Cork and the 1st Southern Division, the most active units in the fight against the British were now anti-treaty. But Collins did remark that many people feel they have arrears to make up, and some of those who had been in areas where actions against the British were remarkably few, Wexford, just to take one example, were now trying to make up for lost time. Various dates can be ascribed to the outbreak of the Civil War. The common one, of course, is the 28th of June, the bombardment of the forecourts. But there are other ones. The 26th of March, when the majority of the army withdrew its allegiance from the Dáil and set up its own executive, effectively setting up a rival government to that that had been established by Dáil majority vote. And then, following on that, on the 14th of April, the seizure of the forecourts in Dublin and other public buildings, providing these rebels with a rival centre of government and authority with which they could launch their attacks, or from which they could launch their attacks on the provisional government. Violence increased steadily. As early as the 5th of April, a Cork TD, Liam de Royster, remarked, "Civil war has already begun." There was a proposal at the Army Council that a military dictatorship be set up, and this was defeated by only a very narrow majority. Within 2 days in May, Republicans raided 25 branches of the Bank of Ireland. And significantly, in that same month, May, a truce was called. And you don't have a truce unless there is already a conflict. De Valera's speeches, to put it mildly, did not facilitate a maintenance of peace. Most famously, in one speech, he warned that the volunteers of the future will have to wade through the blood of Irish citizens, perhaps through the blood of some members of the government, in order to get freedom. Of course, he denied that that was a threat. It was a friendly warning of what they must avoid. On the 18th of June, 2 days after the election that I'll mention in a minute, a small majority of the Forecourts garrison, a very small majority, voted against an immediate attack on British troops. It was clear that a large section of the Republicans wanted to resume the war against the British and to attack Northern Ireland. Among that minority were 12 out of the 16 members of the Army Executive. But all this time, as Ireland was drifting towards civil war, or perhaps already engaged in small-scale civil war, political manoeuvrings were taking place. Elections were due, but the Republicans were determined that there would be no vote on the treaty. They knew that they would be massacred if an election were to be held with the treaty as the main issue. And ultimately, Collins agreed to the famous pact with De Valera in May, the Collins-De Valera Pact, in which the two wings of the Sinn Féin party would not compete against each other in a general election. Each would put forward only the number of candidates of TDs it already had. So, the Free Staters, the government side, would put forward 64 candidates, the Republicans 57. The new third Dáil would be a carbon copy of the old second Dáil. This, of course, was a parody of democracy. It was denounced as such. Arthur Griffith was deeply disgusted. The British government was appalled. But Collins ensured that third parties, Labour, Farmers, Independents, would also be able to run candidates. So the new third Dáil would not be a one-party parliament, as the second Dáil had been until the split. This was opposed by many Republicans. They didn't want any outsiders barging into what was a private agreement between the two rival factions of Sinn Féin. Harry Boland, one of De Valera's principal advisers, said, "No issue is to be decided by the election." But Collins knew that such a deal, undemocratic though it was the only way to hold an election. If he hadn't agreed to it, the Republicans would have ensured there would be no election, and there would be nothing simpler than that. Just kill a few candidates, and the elections will sort of disintegrate, dissipate. All you need to do is to seize ballot papers to cause havoc, and they could do that, and they would do that. So a flawed election, he felt, was better than none at all. So third-party candidates were allowed to run. Although Collins and De Valera, in the words of Michael Gallagher, criticised third parties for exercising the freedom that had been so magnanimously granted to them. They were subjected to intimidation by Republicans. For example, Godfrey Green, a farmer candidate in Waterford, East Tipperary, was besieged at night in his farmhouse, captured and abducted. It's not surprising that he stood down. No contest then was held in 7 of the 28 constituencies, particularly in the west of Ireland. It had been agreed as part of the pact that the new Free State Constitution would be published before polling day. And this was a concession to De Valera to ensure, from his point of view, that the election would not be held simply on the treaty but on other issues. And he was quite confident, rightly confident as it turned out, that the Constitution would in many ways be a disappointment. But Collins cheated. He wasn't just the broth of a boy, he was a cute, shrewd, ruthless politician. He did publish the Constitution before polling day, a few hours before polls opened. Hardly any elector had any chance to read the Constitution. So, effectively, the election took place not on the Constitution, but, as De Valera had feared, on the treaty. And the result, a disaster for the Republicans. Of course, both sides, pro-treaty and anti-treaty Sinn Féin, could only lose, since they had put forward the number of candidates they already had, and any third-party vote, any third-party seat would be at the expense of one or other of them. The Treatyites lost 7 of their 48 seats. The Republicans lost 22 out of 41, over half, a devastating blow. Non-Sinn Féin parties won 40% of the vote, more than either of the two rival pro- or anti-treaty Sinn Féin parties. Labour did spectacularly well, winning 17 seats. It had contested only 18. It lost 1 on the last count. Farmers and independents also did well. In Galway, there were 8 candidates for 7 seats, so 1 would be disappointed. The disappointed one was Liam Mellows, less popular at the time in Galway than he has been since. He lost a seat, the only TD west of the Shannon to do so. As Una Newell put it, the electorate voted decisively for pragmatism over radicalism. And since every non-Sinn Féin candidate supported the treaty, Collins now had his mandate. 78% of the votes were cast for pro-treaty candidates, whether they be his branch of Sinn Féin, Labour, Farmers or Independents. Within 2 weeks, civil war had broken out on a grand scale, with the bombardment of the forecourts. The Republicans had consistently provoked the government, but didn't take the initiative. That, they were decided, should be left with the government. The bulk of the army had opposed the treaty. But in the months before the attack on the forecourts, Collins had busily built up his strength, and he was supplied with weapons, ammunition and means of transport by the British, as well as money. Now, having postponed any confrontation for as long as possible, now he acted decisively. And the fighting in Dublin in 1922 followed the pattern of 1916, of gesture or theatrical politics. The Republicans, even though they'd had months at their disposal, hadn't prepared adequate defensive positions. Attempts to relieve the garrison in Dublin were only half-hearted. It was reported that the tip men wanted to go home. And once it had secured control of Dublin, the government held the initiative for the rest of the war. In the words of Michael Hopkinson, as I mentioned, the first serious historian of the Civil War, the Republicans' strategy was confused and defensive. There was no national plan. Units operated locally. The so-called Munster Republic very soon collapsed, with its 2 extreme wings, Limerick and Waterford, falling to government forces, on the same day. Cork was captured by an amphibious government assault. And as early as the 11th of August, just 6 weeks after the outbreak of fighting, serious fighting, Fermoy, the last town in Ireland held by the Republicans, was taken by the provisional government forces, although a few towns were later recaptured for brief periods. But the pattern of 1916, at least in Dublin, of heroic resistance, of waiting to be attacked, that was followed in the Civil War by the pattern of 1919 to 21, a long and vicious guerrilla campaign. A war that dragged on for months until May 1923, most brutally in Kerry, but also with savage fighting in counties closer to here, to Galway, such as Mayo and Sligo. Galway, by contrast, had a relatively easy war. The city and most towns were evacuated after barracks and so on had been destroyed by the Republicans. But there was, as elsewhere, considerable disruption and destruction. And executions were carried out in Tuam as late as April 1923, in the last full month of the war. The Republicans learned few lessons from history. In 1916, and again in 1920, what was perceived as government brutality by the British forces or British authorities brought about a change in public opinion. So the Republicans were determined to force or to lure, to entrap the government forces into brutality, assuming that the pattern of 1916 and 1920 would be repeated now in 1922. And to an extent it worked. Government forces did behave brutally, as I mentioned, particularly in County Kerry. The Ballyseedy massacre stands out. But, crucially, the Irish people were prepared to accept atrocities by an Irish government that they would not accept from the British. And also, crucially, most people, almost everybody, including most Republicans, knew that only one side, the government, could win the war. So, the sooner the government won, the better. The Republicans knew that they had little popular support. In Donegal, one commander reported that the civilian population was practically 90% Free State. Robert Brennan wrote later, "The people looked at us as if we were a hostile invading army." Revealingly, in Phoenix, in County Kerry, the locals disarmed a landmine laid by the Republicans on the pier in the port, in the town. They didn't want their livelihoods destroyed. Most people accepted that the war could be won by only one side. So the sooner peace was restored, the better. But Liam Lynch, the Republican commander-in-chief, disagreed. He kept on believing against the odds and against the evidence and against the advice of most of his colleagues. Month after month, public opinion will change. We will win in the end, as we won in 1916 and as we won in 1920. His colleagues despaired of victory. He ignored them. By now, De Valera was a totally marginal figure. Carlton Younger, in his book on the revolutionary period, described De Valera as wandering around the south like a plaintive itinerant troubadour. Soldiers, Lynch and his colleagues, took the important decisions. He was kept in the background. He was kept waiting outside a room while Republican commanders discussed whether they would allow him in. Oliver MacDonagh remarked that De Valera, the careful student of Machiavelli, was at the mercy of the zealots. And J.J. Lee, in his famous book that many of you probably know, Ireland 1912 to 85, described De Valera as the victim of political illiterates. Brandon O'Hare, in his wonderful book, The Begrudger's Guide to Irish Politics, referred to the Republicans' appetite for martyrdom. They also had a taste for destruction. They did their best to wreck the country's infrastructure, destroying bridges and rail track, making the country poor and ungovernable, and therefore the government unpopular. From his jail, and he'd been arrested after the fall of the forecourts, Rory O'Connor advised that 100 bridges blown up are just as effective as 100 barracks. Enemies were to be targeted. For example, Lynch ordered that the editors of the Irish Times and Irish Independent should be shot. They weren't. Things were very different on the government side. There, at the beginning, Collins took command, began wearing uniform for the first time since Easter week. Most of the photographs of him show him in uniform, but most of the photographs of him were taken in the last month of his life. And he ran a determined and coordinated campaign until, on the 22nd of August, he was killed in an ambush described by Anne Dolan of Trinity as a shootout the most naive soldier would have shunned. It does seem to me, and I'm sure to you, extraordinary that a head of government should have been so irresponsible as to wander around the battlefield and take risks of an ambush, and then, when ambushed, insist on a fight when his much wiser colleagues wanted to get out as quickly as possible. In that sense, his death was an accident. Planned, of course, but it shouldn't have happened and needn't have happened. It has been suggested, particularly by John Regan, that Collins, before his death, set up a military dictatorship. He remarks, "There was no crisis after Collins's death." Why? Because by that stage, Collins himself was the crisis. Peter Hart, in his biography that I've mentioned already, agrees that Collins was dictatorial. But his powers were already being trimmed by his civilian colleagues before his death. They were overruling him. They were acquiring greater self-confidence. And there's no particular reason to believe that he would have been a dictator had he survived the Civil War. After all, just to take two of the most civilized and democratic societies in our lifetimes, Canada and the Federal Republic of Germany. In both countries in the 1970s, governments had to fight against terrorist campaigns. Pierre Trudeau against the Québécois separatists, and Helmut Schmidt against the Red Army faction, the RAF, supported, of course, by Communist East Germany. In both cases, autocratic powers were taken by the governments that came to an end as soon as the emergency was over. It's not necessarily the case that governments that acquire extra powers in emergencies keep them indefinitely. Civilians, after Collins's death, were now unquestionably in charge. And the new leaders, men like W.T. Cosgrave and Kevin O'Higgins, didn't share Collins's affection towards his old comrades. They proposed and implemented tougher, harsher measures than Collins had done, or possibly, who knows, than Collins would have done had he lived. Rory O'Connor, again quoting one of his letters from prison, said, Cosgrave can very easily be scared out. Instead, shortly afterwards, Cosgrave presided over a cabinet that passed the death sentence on Rory O'Connor and other prisoners. These executions of Childers, Rory O'Connor and the others were brutal, almost certainly illegal. Historians are rightly very, very, very cautious about using the words moral and immoral. We don't like them. But many people would argue that these executions were immoral. Nonetheless, they worked. The four who were shot on the 8th of December were shot in retaliation for the murder by Republicans of a Dáil deputy and the serious injury of another. No more Dáil deputies were shot. The Republicans were horrified by these executions. Ernie O'Malley, in his memoir, referred to the deep shock he felt, almost incomprehension. He had felt that Republicans in jail were safe. Now he knew Republicans in jail were not safe. They might be hauled out from their prison cells and shot in retaliation for actions carried out by their colleagues. That made their colleagues more careful in the actions that they carried out. As Cosgrave said, terror meets terror. And he, a mild man and a thorough Democrat, was unforgiving in his attitude towards the Republicans. He regarded them, described them as the dregs of society. He wanted executions not just in a few counties, as had been the case until then, but throughout the whole country. And this was duly done. Slowly, the Republicans were worn down. And then, quite suddenly, almost by accident, it came to an end. Accident because Liam Lynch was shot and killed. Accident because he was on the run with 5 colleagues. A group of Free State soldiers shot at them in a very far distance, totally out of range, they thought, hitting one of them. They had no idea who it was. It turned out to be Lynch. So he was the victim of an accident almost to the same extent as Collins had been. His death brought an end to the Civil War. His successor as the Commander-in-Chief, Frank Aiken, immediately decided not on a ceasefire but on a suspension of operations, hiding a burying of arms, and the fighting came to an end. Let me, in the time that remains, not much, let me make a few general comments, some of them quotations from other historians. Bill Kissane, in his The Politics of the Irish Civil War, points out, valuably I think, that the Civil War occurred in a milieu of general consensus on other issues, which made it very much easier, once the fighting had stopped, for people to agree on other topics and other points. John Regan complains that during and after the war, Ireland experienced a counter-revolution, that the radicalism characteristic of the revolution was being undone by a conservative elite. This, I believe, is nonsense. As Anne Dolan of Trinity points out, if electoral politics are any measure, then independent Ireland showed little appetite for more change than it had already got. And we must never forget that the Irish social revolution was over before the political and military revolution began. Because the Irish social revolution was the Land Acts and the transfer of land ownership. So Ireland was not in the position of so many other countries that had to bring about sweeping land reforms and change of ownership of land and property after the revolution. That had already been done by the British. Oliver MacDonagh points out that the new Free State government of Cosgrave imposed traditional British policy with an authority and a single-mindedness that Irish administrations had lacked almost since the Act of Union. Tom Garvin, in his book 1922, has referred to the ruthless determination with which the government imposed democracy on the Republicans. And Joe Lee, to quote him again, remarked that the aspiring military dictators were crushed. But it is one of the great ironies of the Civil War and its aftermath that De Valera, so seriously, systematically incompetent between 1921 and 1923, became the master politician of his time. Perhaps one could see a certain parallel between the first 2 disastrous governments of Charles Haughey and his relatively successful third one. Republicans who took arms against an elected government soon formed one of the most successful political parties in Europe, Fianna Fáil. And another irony, Collins, in his famous remark that the treaty gave Ireland not full freedom, but the freedom to achieve freedom, was proved right by De Valera, who did what Collins would dearly liked to have done. Partition, of course, remained unsolved, but partition hadn't been an issue in the treaty debates. Only 2 deputies, one on each side, spoke about it at any length. It wasn't an issue in the Civil War. In the Civil War, on the contrary, the two sides fought each other about issues that had nothing to do with the North, with partition. And IRA men in the North rushed south from the 6 counties, from Northern Ireland to the Free State, to kill each other over issues that related not in the slightest to their own concerns as inhabitants of Northern Ireland. It's significant that until the Civil War began in earnest on the 28th of June, Craig and his cabinet met 2, 3, 4 times a week. Once the fighting broke out in Dublin, no need anymore. They could meet once every 2 or 3 weeks. The crisis was over. The threat from the south was gone. So, one could argue that the Civil War began the pattern that has endured ever since, whereby the South, Free State and Republic, turns its back on Northern nationalists. For the South, for the Free State and Republic, the Civil War was, of course, an undoubted tragedy, and perhaps an avoidable tragedy. But at least it was the occasion of the bloody birth of a stable and peaceful democracy. After all, to look again at an international context, of all the new states that emerged in Europe during and after the First World War, only Finland, which, as I mentioned, had a much worse civil war than Ireland, could rival Ireland's record of democracy and stability. And so, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, in this centenary year, with a government consisting of the two pro- and anti-treaty sides operating together for the first time in a century, we can examine the Civil War with detachment, but above all, I would suggest, with compassion.